Hello everyone, welcome to the Meditations on Humanities. In this introductory video I will demonstrate what problems and issues I will be addressing in the subsequent series. If I were to tell you what this series is about in one sentence, I would say that this is my attempt at addressing the problem of the human condition. What we are, how should we study ourselves, how should we study the world around us. What this series is not about is it's not a dogmatic instruction as to what you should do in your life, rather what you could and maybe what you should do to study the reality. What ways there are to approach your self-education, so to speak. What mistakes there are to await and to try and avoid. And of course we cannot speak about the humanity without speaking of a human, of a person. And I would be approaching this problem of a person from, let's say, three definitions. We can take three definitions of a person. The first is a person as an observer. Now, when we talk about people as observers, it's already a cliche to cite Aristotle here, where in the very first line of his first book, in his Metaphysics, he says that all people are naturally curious. All people seek knowledge. And he says that the evidence for it is that we don't just use our senses, hearing, seeing, tasting, for some practical use, but we also use them for the sake of themselves. We listen to music. We don't have to do that. It's not practical. We go to the theater, so on. In approaching the questions of studying the reality and humans, we might ask ourselves these questions. What is there to study? What is the world? What is the reality? What is a person? How can we do that? What can we not study? What are our limits? And maybe what the mistakes are that we should try and avoid before we make them. The second definition of a person might be it's somebody that communicates. We have language, we speak to each other, and Aristotle calls people zoon politikon, which means a political being, a being of societal being, civic being. So we naturally live around other people and we need to communicate. And the question here would be how to use language effectively. What can we communicate? What can we not communicate? How to do the communication effectively? And also what misunderstandings are commonplace? What should we try and avoid? And I think it's quite obvious that we do make a lot of mistakes when it comes to the communication. When speaking to people, we all sometimes have fights, and we seemingly talk about the same thing, but then at the end of the fight it turns out that we have not been talking about the same thing. We sort of speak different languages, even with the persons that we love, the persons that are dear to us. That is of course problematic. So from here we can see a very clear practicality of this knowledge, the knowledge of how to use language effectively. The third perspective, or looking at a person, the third definition of a person is somebody who thinks, analyzes, creates theories and tests them. That we might say is a philosophy in its original term. A philosopher is a person that strives for the truth or the knowledge, a person that abstracts, transcends the phenomena, the reality, to try and see some generalities, to see the patterns, to find the best schema to follow in life. Now, some people would say that, speaking in derogatory terms about somebody that they don't like, they would say that these people are not curious enough. The people are not people who are not studying. Those people are not questioning anything. But I don't think that is the problem. I think that everybody pretty much questions the reality. Everybody questions everything. We are all philosophers naturally. We all ask ourselves philosophical questions continually. The problem here is that we sometimes answer these questions all too quickly. We sometimes do not hesitate. Sometimes we're not humble enough to admit that we can be foolish, that we have no answer. And So this is a problem that I will be addressing. How to maybe try to teach yourself be more humble and not be afraid of being a fool. How to be the true philosopher, how to be like a child that is not constrained by fears of being ridiculed. I would summarize this short passage in this phrase: we are all philosophers, but to be good philosophers, we need to think the best we can. We don't always have to just act. We sometimes have to pause and think and analyze and find a better solution. What is my motivation to speak about it? Two things. First is that I do believe that we can have, in at least practical limits, some knowledge. We can have some certainty in some phenomena of life. Second thing is that we can use knowledge to bring about good and also to bring about bad. We can use knowledge to perpetuate evil and promote goodness. And I think that this is important, and this is why it's interesting to me to study humanity, to study people, to study myself, is to find the answer to the questions: why are some people good and some people bad? How can we understand the motivation behind seemingly good acts? And also, how can we find the motivation of obviously bad, evil acts? How can we fight with the propaganda which is ubiquitous right now? How can we lead a safe life in this ton ocean of information? How can we protect ourselves from the extra influence, from some malevolent influence, so to speak? So these are the questions that are most important to me, and I will be talking about different ways to approach understanding these questions throughout the subsequent videos. Now, with all that being said, I also want to add a few words about the method that I will be using. And I think we can split this method into three components, three aspects. The first we might call something like eclectic anachronistic approach. That is to say that I will be presenting theories and ideas, not in their historical development, that is synchronistic. I would be rather taking the point of view at reality, at how different people from different epochs were trying to address the question and solve them. That is why it's called anachronistic, because I would be taking Kafka and Sextus Empiricus in one conversation. So the division between them is almost 2000 years. So that's why it's anachronistic. But I do think that it's very useful to look at reality as, to look at studying the reality as just different ways, different words, different terminology, which describe sometimes quite the same things. And we are often confused by traditional school methods, studying history, development of ideas in its synchronicity. That is to say, in the philosophy departments, you would study the ancient philosophy, going on to the medieval, going on to modern, and so on. But the thing is that what this can sometimes create, and does sometimes create, is this false understanding that some ideas developed in the 20th century had never been developed, had never been addressed before the 20th century. So now I will show that some of the greatest ideas, that some of the greatest concepts developed by the thinkers of the 20th and 21st centuries had already been addressed by some of the philosophers, at least in part, in the antiquity. So the good side of this approach is that we don't necessarily have to understand the whole historical concept to understand some of the ideas. We can take the ideas of Plato without really knowing the realities of Plato and try to find the connection with our reality. And I will be doing that in part to try and break this idea, to try and break this view that reality can only be discussed in its epochs. The second aspect of the method that I'll be using, we might call something like, the first one was anachronistic, the second will be synchronistic, or maybe even historical or synthetic. The first was eclectic, so I will be talking about Kafka, Dostoevsky and Plato in the same conversation. The second way of presenting these problems of humanity will be synthetic. That is to say that I'll be taking one epoch and I will try and show different ways of different ideas developed within a very small temporal frame, by a small group of people. So I would be focusing just on Plato, Aristotle and Socrates, for example. This aspect of the method is great because it will show how vast the influence of the external condition is on our thinking. That is to say that the first method will show that it's not really important when the idea appeared. What is important is how we can use this idea in our practical life. Like Kafka and Plato, even Kafka is already classics to us. He lived 100 years ago, but still I will show how he is relevant and how also Plato, who lived 2000 years ago, is relevant to our modern day problems. While using this second aspect of the method, I will also introduce the idea of complexity, the idea of the almost impossibility of prediction when you take into account how many factors there are that can be influential. So I will take one personality, one idea even, and show how this theory is great, but also how we can not really use it to our full potential, or maybe even better, how every theory is not good enough, how even the greatest theory of psychology are not good enough, in the sense of they don't explicate the reality to some full scale, but it will make more sense later, I promise. Now to the last aspect, and to this last aspect of the method I think we can call something like a transcendent approach, or maybe the word synthetic would be best applied here and not when talking about the second aspect. So why synthetic, why transcendent? Well, because I think that there is a way to come up with some sort of a superordinate superstructure, some underlying base for all other disciplines, for all other domains of knowledge. And when speaking about this part of this aspect of the method, I will be introducing the idea of evolution and how this perception of reality changed and affects our worldview in terms of even mathematics and chemistry, physics, how evolution is everywhere, so speaking figuratively, and how these principles of evolution can be governing all our systems of knowledge, how we can use the evolutionary psychological approach, Theodore Millen's approach, to explain all the peculiarities of ourselves, our personalities, how we can use it to understand why we act the way we do. To summarize, in whatever will be discussed, the person, the subject, the human will be in the center of it all, because I think that it's the easiest way to start is by starting with ourselves. We cannot, before we start talking about some objective reality, we can start by talking about how we perceive this objective reality, which we might put in quotes here. And then by developing these ideas, we might approach some understanding of whether we actually can be talking about some objective reality, and whether we should even. I would like to finish this by just bringing up one great American philosopher. His name is Thomas Scanlon, and I'm bringing him up basically just to tell you about the book that he wrote, and the book is called What We Owe to Each Other. And I think this is such a great title, and it's really just the title that I'm bringing it up, because I do think that we as humans owe a lot to each other. I think that to find the answer to the fundamental question of how to live a good life, we actually have to understand what is it that we owe to each other? What is it that we have to, that we ought to do for each other? How can we understand ourselves to such a degree that we would stop making foolish mistakes, that we would stop breaking each other's hearts, that we would stop, or maybe at least do it less often? How can we find some, not a compromise, but how can we find some points of agreement on some fundamental topics? That again, it's not some super abstract philosophy that nobody cares about. Everybody does care about. It's, again, as I said earlier, some people just find answers too quickly without doubting them, and they are not to blame for it. I do not blame anybody for it, and this is the thing, that however much are we studying anything, we are still prone to making simple, quite obvious, sometimes foolish mistakes. But bearing in mind that we are here on Earth living with each other, we owe a lot to each other. Bearing this simple idea in mind, that, and believing in it, it's not just enough to think about it. I do believe in it. I think that we do owe a lot to each other, and this can be a great motivator to try and look for some truths in life. And that's why it's humanities, that's why it's practical and important. And yeah, well, if you enjoyed this video, maybe you'll enjoy the next ones. And I hope to see you there. I thank you for having watched this one. I hope it made sense. And yeah, see you next time.